John watched in horror as the scarecrow shambled towards him. Its movements were jerky and uneven, but it seemed to be getting closer with each step. John tried to back away, but his feet felt like they were glued to the ground. As the scarecrow approached, John could see that its eyes were glowing a sickly green color. Its mouth opened, and John could hear the sound of twigs and leaves crunching together. It was as if the scarecrow was trying to speak, but all that came out was a series of guttural moans. John knew he had to do something, but he was frozen in fear. He could feel his heart racing in his chest as the scarecrow reached out a bony hand towards him. Just when all seemed lost, John heard the sound of a truck approaching. It was his neighbor Tom, who had come to check on him after seeing the fire at the barn. Tom saw the scene and quickly realized what was happening. He raised his own shotgun and fired a shot at the scarecrow. The scarecrow fell to the ground, and its body began to convulse. Then, as suddenly as it had come to life, it went still. Tom helped John to his feet, and they both stood there staring at the lifeless scarecrow. They knew that they had been lucky to survive. In the days that followed, the Wilsons moved away from the farm. They could never forget what had happened and never wanted to go through it again. The legend of the scarecrow continued to be told in the town, but it was no longer a superstition. The Wilsons had learned the hard way that some legends were based on reality, and that reality could be far more terrifying than anything they had ever imagined. The priest told the family that there was only one way to banish the demon back to the depths of hell. They had to perform a ritual that involved sacrificing something of great value. The family was hesitant, but they knew that they had no other choice. They decided to sacrifice their most precious possession, their beloved farm. They burned the crops in the fields and destroyed everything that had been touched by the demon. The family watched in sorrow as their home and their livelihood burned to the ground. They had lost everything, but they knew that they had rid themselves of the demon. The family moved away from the farm, hoping to start anew. They never forgot the lessons they had learned, and they warned others never to make deals with strangers, no matter how desperate they may be. The memory of the stranger still haunted them, and they wondered if he was still out there, preying on other vulnerable families, waiting for the next drought to strike. And so the story of the farming family and the stranger became a cautionary tale, a warning of the dangers of making deals with the devil. The family had paid a terrible price for their mistake, but their sacrifice had saved others from falling prey to the demon's trap. Years passed, and the family tried to forget about the stranger and their tragic past. They moved on with their lives, and they found some semblance of happiness in their new home. But the memory of the stranger and the terrible price they paid never left them. They often wondered what had happened to the demon, and whether it was still out there, waiting for its next victim. One night, while sitting by the fire, the family heard a knock at the door. They hesitated, but eventually they answered it. Standing on the doorstep was a man, tall and thin with piercing eyes. The family recognized him immediately, and they knew that the stranger had returned. They were filled with dread, but the stranger smiled and said that he had come to make amends. He told the family that he had been cursed, and that he had been forced to prey on vulnerable families for centuries. But he had grown tired of his cursed existence, and he had come to offer the family a gift. The stranger handed the family a box, and he told them that it contained something that would make up for the terrible price they had paid. The family was hesitant, but they opened the box. Inside, they found a single seed, small and unassuming. The stranger told them that the seed was special and that it would bring them great prosperity and happiness. The family planted the seed, and soon their fields were lush and green. The crops grew tall and strong, and the family was able to thrive once again. They knew that the stranger had kept his promise and that they had been given a second chance. The Johnson family had been searching for the perfect farmhouse for years, and they finally found it. The old weathered building had been empty for years, and the family could see the potential in the property. They moved in and began to settle into their new home. But one thing puzzled them. There was a large barn on the property, which was locked with a heavy padlock. The previous owner had warned them not to go near the barn, but the family couldn't resist the temptation to investigate. One night, the family gathered together and decided to break the lock and enter the barn. They found nothing at first, but as they dug deeper, they discovered something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The barn was filled with disturbing artifacts and strange markings on the walls. The family knew they had made a grave mistake, but it was too late to turn back. As they were about to leave, they heard a strange noise coming from the back of the barn. They cautiously approached, and what they saw was too horrifying for words. A figure, barely human in appearance, was staring back at them with empty eyes. The family knew they had to get out of there, but the figure blocked their way. They were trapped in the barn, with no way out. The family tried to push past the figure blocking their way out of the barn, but it was too strong. They realized that they were in grave danger, and that they had made a terrible mistake by entering the barn. As they stood there, frozen with fear, the figure began to move towards them, its slow and jerky movements sending shivers down their spines. It was unlike anything they had ever seen before, with its distorted features and unnatural movements. The family knew they had to act fast if they wanted to survive. They started to back away slowly, keeping their eyes on the figure as it advanced towards them. But as they reached the door, they realized that it was locked from the outside. They were trapped, with no way to escape. The figure was getting closer, and the family could feel its cold breath on their faces. They knew they had to fight for their lives. One of them grabbed a shovel that was leaning against the wall and swung it at the figure. It connected with a sickening thud, and the figure stumbled backwards. The family saw their chance and ran towards the other side of the barn, hoping to find another way out. But as they turned the corner, they saw something that made them freeze in terror. The walls were covered in strange symbols and markings, and they could feel an oppressive energy emanating from them. They knew that they had stumbled upon something ancient and evil, something that should have remained hidden forever. As they stood there, trapped and surrounded by darkness, they knew that their only chance of survival was to find a way out. But could they escape the evil that lurked within the barn? The family's search for a way out of the barn became more desperate with each passing moment. They could hear the sound of footsteps echoing through the darkness, and they knew that the figure was still following them. The family had never felt such terror in their lives. They were in a situation they could never have imagined, and they didn't know if they would ever make it out alive. As they searched for a way out, they came across a door that was partially hidden by a pile of debris. They quickly realized that it was their only chance, and they forced the door open. But what they found on the other side was worse than anything they had seen before. They found a small room with a table in the center. On the table was a collection of strange and gruesome objects, including human bones and a rusted knife. Suddenly, they heard a voice from behind them. It was the figure. It had somehow found them. The family turned to face it, but they were paralyzed with fear. The figure was now closer than ever, and they could see that its features were distorted and twisted beyond recognition. As the figure approached, the family realized that their fate was sealed. They had been foolish to enter the barn, and now they were paying the ultimate price. But just as the figure was about to reach them, something miraculous happened. A beam of light shone down from above, illuminating the room and banishing the darkness. The figure shrieked in agony, and the family felt a sense of relief wash over them. They looked up and saw a hole in the ceiling, through which the light was pouring. Without hesitation, they made their way towards the hole, climbing up to freedom. As they emerged from the barn, they looked back and saw that the figure had been destroyed by the light. The family knew that they had been lucky to escape with their lives, but they also knew that they would never forget the terror they had experienced in the barn. Every autumn, the local farm would transform its fields into a giant corn maze, attracting families from all over the region. It was a popular attraction, with different paths and dead ends to keep visitors entertained and challenged for hours. However, there were rumors and stories about strange occurrences in the maze, especially after dark. Some people claimed to have seen shadows moving between the tall stalks, or heard whispers and laughter from unseen sources. Others spoke of missing children who wandered off and never returned. Despite these tales, the farm's owner, Mr. Johnson, reassured everyone that the maze was perfectly safe and supervised by trained staff. He even organized special events for teenagers, where they could explore the maze after hours with flashlights and friends. This year, a group of 5 friends decided to participate in the after-hours event, eager for some excitement and adventure. Their names were Lisa, John, Marcus, Alex, and Rachel. They were all high school seniors, ready to graduate and go their separate ways. Lisa was the leader of the group, with short blonde hair and a confident demeanor. John was the joker, always making sarcastic comments and teasing his friends. Marcus was the quiet one, who preferred to observe rather than participate. Alex was the athlete, tall and muscular, with a competitive streak. Rachel was the artistic one, with long brown hair and a dreamy gaze. As they entered the maze, Lisa made sure they had plenty of batteries and snacks, and reminded them to stick together. They started off well, following the twists and turns, and laughing at each other's jokes. However, after a while, they realized that the maze was more challenging than they expected. The paths seemed to repeat themselves, or lead to dead ends, or disappear altogether. The signs that were supposed to guide them were missing or vandalized. They started to feel disoriented and frustrated, and their laughter turned into arguments. "Are you sure we haven't been here before?" John asked, shining his flashlight on the walls of corn. "I don't know. Everything looks the same," Marcus said, his voice barely audible. "We should have brought a map or something," Alex grumbled, checking his phone for signal. "We can't give up now. We're almost halfway through," Lisa said, trying to sound optimistic. Rachel didn't say anything, but her eyes darted around, as if she sensed something they didn't. They continued walking, hoping to find a way out, but the maze seemed to grow more complex and sinister. The stalks were taller and thicker, blocking their view of the sky and the surrounding fields. The air was damp and chilly, and the only sounds were their footsteps and breathing. Suddenly, they heard a rustling sound behind them. Lisa turned around and pointed her flashlight, but didn't see anything. "Did you hear that?" she asked. "Hear what?" John said, looking at her with a smirk. "I thought I heard something moving," Lisa said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's probably just a raccoon or a rabbit or something," Alex said, trying to calm her down. But then they heard it again, closer this time. It was a low growl, like an animal, but deeper and more guttural. They all froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. The growl turned into a snarl, and they saw a pair of glowing eyes, reflecting their flashlights. It was a large black shape, crouched low to the ground, with ragged fur and sharp teeth. "What the hell is that?" John exclaimed, taking a step back. Lisa shone her flashlight on the creature, trying to get a better look. It didn't move, but its eyes followed them, as if assessing their presence. They could see now that it wasn't a dog or any other recognizable animal. Its body was too large, too muscular, and too distorted. Its head was elongated, with pointed ears and a snout that seemed to split open into a grin. Its claws dug into the ground, leaving deep marks. "It's not a dog, that's for sure," Marcus whispered. "Let's get out of here," Rachel said, grabbing Lisa's arm. But as they turned around, they saw that the path they came from was gone. The corn stalks had closed in, forming a thick wall that blocked their way. They tried to push through, but it was like a living barrier, resisting their efforts. "What the hell is going on?" John yelled, his voice rising. The creature growled again, and they realized that it was not alone. They heard other growls, other shapes moving in the darkness, closing in on them. Lisa looked around, trying to find a way out, but all she saw was a maze of walls and shadows. She felt a surge of panic, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Okay, guys, we need to stick together and find a way out. Don't run or split up, or we'll never make it," she said, her voice firm. They nodded, looking at her for guidance. Lisa led the way, shining her flashlight on the ground, trying to find any signs of direction. They walked slowly, cautiously, as if every step could trigger an attack. The growls grew louder, closer, and more numerous. They could hear the sound of breathing, of paws scraping the ground, of teeth grinding. Suddenly, they heard a scream. It was Marcus who had fallen behind. They turned around and saw him being dragged away by a dark shape. He was struggling, trying to free himself, but the creature was too strong. Lisa and Alex ran towards him, shouting and swinging their flashlights, but the creature threw Marcus aside and charged at them. Lisa and Alex barely had time to dodge, but John and Rachel tackled the creature from behind, pushing it away. They heard the sound of bones cracking, of fur tearing, and of the creature's anger. They saw its face, twisted into a mask of fury, its eyes glowing with hatred. "Run!" Lisa yelled, pulling Marcus to his feet. They ran, not looking back, not caring where they were going. They felt the creatures behind them, chasing them, hunting them. They heard the sound of screams, of snarls, of footsteps. They felt the thorns of the cornstalks cutting their skin, the mud of the ground sucking their shoes. They saw glimpses of moonlight, of stars, of the farm's buildings. They ran until they reached a fence, which they climbed over, ignoring the pain and the danger. They stumbled into the open field, panting and crying, not sure if they were alive or dead. They looked around, trying to see if they were safe, but the creatures were gone. They saw only the empty fields, the distant lights of the farm, and the stars. What the hell was that? John asked, his voice hoarse. I don't know, but we have to tell someone, Lisa said, her eyes wide with fear. They walked towards the farm, not sure if they were dreaming or awake, if they were alive or dead. They heard the sound of music, of laughter, of children playing. They saw the maze looming in the darkness. When they reached the farm, they were greeted by Mr. Johnson, the owner, who was surprised to see them. What are you doing here? The maze is closed, he said, frowning. We need help, Mr. Johnson. There's something in the maze, something dangerous, Lisa said, her voice shaking. Mr. Johnson looked at them, then at the maze, then back at them. He sighed. I've heard these stories before. Kids getting lost, kids scaring themselves, kids making up tales. There's nothing in the maze that can hurt you, he said, his tone dismissive. But we saw it, we felt it, we fought it, Rachel said, her eyes pleading. Mr. Johnson looked at her, then at the others. He saw the scratches on their arms, the dirt on their clothes, the fear in their eyes. He sighed again. Okay, let's go inside and talk about this, he said, leading them to a cabin. Inside, they sat around a table, while Mr. Johnson poured them some water. Now tell me what happened, he said, his expression serious. They told him everything, from the moment they entered the maze to the moment they escaped. They described the creatures, the growls, the attacks. They showed him their bruises, their cuts, their torn clothes. Mr. Johnson listened carefully, nodding occasionally, but not saying anything. When they finished, he looked at them again, his eyes searching. I believe you, he said finally. They looked at him surprised. You do? Lisa asked, her voice uncertain. Yes, I do. Because I've heard these stories before, and because I've seen things myself, he said, his voice low. What things? Alex asked, leaning forward. Things that I can't explain, things that I don't want to explain. But I can tell you this. The maze is not just a maze. It's a trap, he said, his tone grim. A trap. What do you mean? Marcus asked, his eyes wide. I mean that the maze is designed to confuse and disorient people, to make them lose their way, to make them vulnerable. And when they're vulnerable, when they're alone, when they're scared, something comes for them. Something that doesn't belong to this world, he said, his voice almost a whisper. They looked at him, not sure if he was joking or serious. But they could see the lines of worry on his face, the shadows in his eyes. What can we do? How can we stop it? Rachel asked, her voice trembling. You can't stop it. You can only avoid it. Don't go in the maze after dark. Don't go in the maze alone. Don't go in the maze at all, he said, his voice firm. They nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. They knew they were lucky to have escaped, that they were not the first ones to encounter the maze's horrors, and that they might not be the last ones. As they left the cabin, they saw the maze again, in the distance, silent and menacing. They felt a shiver run down their spines, and they knew they would never forget that night. They would never forget the maze, the creatures, and the fear they experienced. Jake was a farmer who lived on a small plot of land in the countryside. He had lived on this land all his life, but he had never realized that there was an old well on his property until one day when he was plowing his field. As he was driving his tractor, he felt a sudden jolt and heard a loud thud. When he got off to investigate, he saw that he had hit something buried in the ground. As he began to dig, he soon realized that it was the top of an old well that he had never seen before. Intrigued by this discovery, Jake decided to investigate the well further. As he peered into the darkness, he realized that the well was much deeper than he had anticipated, and he couldn't see the bottom. He wondered how long it had been there and why he had never noticed it before. As he began to descend the well using a rope, he felt an eerie chill running down his spine. The air was damp and musty, and the silence was broken only by the sound of dripping water. After what felt like an eternity, Jake finally reached the bottom of the well. As he looked around, he realized that the well was only the beginning of something much bigger. He could see a series of underground tunnels stretching out in all directions. Jake couldn't believe his eyes. He had never heard of any underground tunnels on his property, and he couldn't imagine what they could have been used for. As he began to explore them, he noticed that they were narrow and claustrophobic, with barely enough room for him to squeeze through. As he made his way through the tunnels, he noticed strange markings on the walls, like something had been scratched into the stone. He also noticed that there was a strange smell in the air, like something rotting. As he pushed deeper into the tunnels, he suddenly heard a noise coming from one of the side passages. It sounded like a faint whisper, but he couldn't make out what it was saying. As he crept closer, he suddenly realized that there were people living down here. He could see several figures huddled in the shadows, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. They were emaciated and covered in filth, and they looked like they had been living down here for a long time. As Jake tried to back away, he suddenly felt a hand on his shoulder. He spun around to see a man standing behind him, his eyes wild and his face twisted in a grotesque snarl. Jake tried to pull away, but the man was surprisingly strong. He pulled him into a small chamber where there were several other people waiting. They were all staring at him with a mixture of fear and desperation. It soon became clear that these people had been living down here for a long time, maybe even generations. They had been cut off from the outside world and had been surviving on whatever they could find in the tunnels. As Jake tried to make sense of what was happening, he suddenly realized that there was an even darker truth behind their existence. He found an old journal lying on the ground, which detailed the story of the previous inhabitants of the farm. According to the journal, the previous owner of the farm had been a cruel man who had enslaved and tortured several families who had been living on his property. He had forced them to build the underground tunnels and had used them for his own nefarious purposes. The journal also revealed that the previous owner had eventually met a violent end, but the people he had enslaved had been left to fend for themselves in the tunnels. They had survived for years by eating rats and insects and had descended into madness. As Jake read the journal, he realized that he was now trapped in the same situation as the people who had been enslaved before him. He knew that he needed to find a way out of the tunnels before it was too late. But as he tried to leave, he realized that the people living in the tunnels were not going to let him go. They had become desperate and violent, and they saw him as a threat to their survival. Jake was forced to fight for his life as he made his way back towards the well. He was able to use his farming tools as makeshift weapons and fought his way through the horde of crazed people who were trying to stop him. Finally, he reached the well and began to climb the rope to the surface. But as he was halfway up, he suddenly felt something grab his ankle. He looked down to see one of the people from the tunnels reaching up to pull him back down. With all his strength, Jake kicked the man off and continued to climb. He emerged from the well, gasping for air and covered in sweat and grime. As he looked back at the well, he knew that he had narrowly escaped with his life. But he also knew that the horrors of the tunnels would haunt him for the rest of his days. From that day on, Jake made sure to always keep a watchful eye on his property, knowing that there could be other hidden dangers lurking beneath the surface. The small farm of the Wilson family was located on the outskirts of a rural town. They had lived there for generations, working hard to keep the land productive and profitable. It was a quiet life, but one that suited them well. That is until strange occurrences began happening on the farm. At first, it was just small things. Tools went missing. Doors would be left open that they knew they had closed, and strange noises could be heard late at night. But as time went on, the occurrences became more frequent and more disturbing. One night, the Wilsons' barn was set on fire. They managed to put it out before it spread, but the damage was done. The next morning, the family patriarch, John Wilson, decided it was time to take action. John had heard the stories about the scarecrow from the older farmers in the area. They said it was a local legend that had been around for generations. The scarecrow was said to have the power to ward off any unwanted visitors to the farm. John was a practical man and didn't believe in such superstitions, but he was desperate to protect his family and his livelihood, so he decided to give it a try. He built a scarecrow himself and put it in the field closest to the house. For the first few days, everything seemed to be working as John had hoped. The strange occurrences stopped, and the farm returned to its usual routine. But as the days went on, John began to notice something strange about the scarecrow. It was as if a scarecrow was alive. John dismissed the idea as ridiculous, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him. The scarecrow's eyes seemed to follow him as he moved about the farm. At night, John would sometimes hear the sound of rustling leaves and shuffling feet coming from the direction of the scarecrow. He tried to convince himself that it was just the wind, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. One day, John went out to the field to check on the scarecrow. As he approached, he noticed that the scarecrow's clothes were tattered and torn. He could see that the stuffing had started to spill out from its arms and legs. As he got closer, John noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were scratch marks on the scarecrow's face. It was as if something had tried to claw its way out from the inside. John knew he had to get rid of the scarecrow, but he didn't know how. Every time he tried to take it down, he would feel a sense of dread wash over him, and he would quickly change his mind. One night, John was woken up by the sound of his son, Timmy, crying. He went to check on him and found that he was covered in scratches and bruises. When John asked what had happened, Timmy said that the scarecrow had come to life and attacked him. John was terrified but still didn't believe in the supernatural. He thought that someone must be playing a sick joke on his family. He decided to set up a camera in the field to catch whoever was responsible. The next day, John checked the footage from the camera. What he saw made his blood run cold. The scarecrow was moving on its own. It would shift its position, as if to get a better view of the house, and then go still again. But then, something even more disturbing happened. A figure emerged from the shadows and approached the scarecrow. John couldn't make out the person, but it was clear that they were up to no good. The figure produced a knife and began to slash at the scarecrow's face. John watched in horror as the stuffing spilled out, and the scarecrow seemed to convulse with each blow. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the figure stopped and walked away. John knew he had to take action. He couldn't let whatever was happening continue. He grabbed his shotgun and headed out to the field. As he approached the scarecrow, he saw that it was even more damaged than it had been on the camera. The stuffing was completely gone from one arm, and it hung limply at its side. Its face was a mass of cuts and slashes, and its hat had been knocked off. But as John raised his shotgun, something strange happened. The scarecrow's head snapped up, and its eyes locked onto his. John froze, unable to pull the trigger. The scarecrow began to move. Its limbs creaked as it pulled itself up to its full height. John could see that it was no longer just a bundle of straw and old clothes. It was something else entirely. John watched in horror as the scarecrow shambled towards him. Its movements were jerky and uneven, but it seemed to be getting closer with each step. John tried to back away, but his feet felt like they were glued to the ground. As the scarecrow approached, John could see that its eyes were glowing a sickly green color. Its mouth opened, and John could hear the sound of twigs and leaves crunching together. It was as if the scarecrow was trying to speak, but all that came out was a series of guttural moans. John knew he had to do something, but he was frozen in fear. He could feel his heart racing in his chest as the scarecrow reached out a bony hand towards him. Just when all seemed lost, John heard the sound of a truck approaching. It was his neighbor Tom, who had come to check on him after seeing the fire at the barn. Tom saw the scene and quickly realized what was happening. He raised his own shotgun and fired a shot at the scarecrow. The scarecrow fell to the ground, and its body began to convulse. Then, as suddenly as it had come to life, it went still. Tom helped John to his feet, and they both stood there staring at the lifeless scarecrow. They knew that they had been lucky to survive. In the days that followed, the Wilsons moved away from the farm. They could never forget what had happened and never wanted to go through it again. The legend of the scarecrow continued to be told in the town, but it was no longer a superstition. The Wilsons had learned the hard way that some legends were based on reality, and that reality could be far more terrifying than anything they had ever imagined.